Well, one of the biggest questions is to understand how the virus um, is physically recognized by the body, and then how those processes function to drive the innate and then the adaptive immune response to infection. What we're finding in the patients is that it looks like they have a very aggressive immune response that is overwhelming and in the worst cases debilitating, in that the virus turns on immune processes that are actually contributing to disease. So we need to know what those processes are, how they're triggered, and then how can we intervene with this type of outcome. So I think those are the biggest questions that we're facing right now. So coronaviruses, first of all, to address your last question, coronaviruses are physically different from the flu. Number one, because the coronavirus family are viruses that have one long genome piece of RNA, and influenza viruses have multiple pieces of nucleic acid in their genome. Now, that's just one of the major differences, but physiologically, the coronaviruses as a family circulate around the globe and typically cause what we consider to be the common cold. In any given year, people get infected with what we'll call contemporary coronaviruses that cause a cold, runny nose, maybe a slight fever and some aches and pains for a few days, but people recover from that. So the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronaviruses, SARS that came out several years ago, and this new SARS-CoV-2 are different because they cause very severe and fatal respiratory disease. The current coronavirus differs from all the other coronaviruses genetically, which gives it its own name. So that's why we call it SARS-CoV-2. It's different from SARS-1, if you will, because there are multiple genetic distinctions across the genome. And importantly, the spike protein, the protein that gives the coronavirus its name because it sticks out around the edge of the virus and make it look like the corona of the sun. If you look at it under the electron microscope, the spike protein is what attaches to cells. And the spike protein from CoV-2, the current coronavirus, versus the current SARS virus versus the previous SARS virus is unique. It's subtly different, and it's different enough that the infection properties could be physiologically different. So this current virus, we're learning, of course, it's spread much more wider and disseminates more rapidly, so the infection behavior is quite a bit different from the previous SARS virus. And then, of course, the syndrome, the respiratory disease syndrome that it's linked to, that we now call COVID-19, that syndrome is different because it's slower in progressing. Some patients do very bad and die from this syndrome, but most people recover just fine. So the previous SARS was a very aggressive acute infection that was not as widely spread and physiologically created an acute and often devastating disease. So the two viruses are similar, but they have very clinically different behavior. Yeah, so that type of treatment is called passive antibody therapy, where you collect blood plasma that contains antibodies from somebody who survived infection and controlled the infection eventually with their own antibodies, and we transfer that plasma into another infected individual to treat their infection using the previous person's antibodies. Passive antibody therapy can be a very effective treatment. It's experimental still. We don't know how well it works for this SARS coronavirus 2. There are studies, clinical studies that are being developed to actually directly address whether or not passive antibody therapy will be a viable option for treating COVID-19 disease. And so I see this as a potential therapeutic that holds a lot of hope for treating people, but it has yet to be tested. Yes, that's right. It can be risky. So the best data suggests that 6 feet is better than 3 feet because we know the distance by which fomites, again, the aerosol droplets that would contain virus, travel when people talk. Some people talk louder than others, so when they talk louder, they expel more air, and that's why maintaining a 6-foot distance is better than 3 feet. Now, on the other hand, when people sneeze, or if somebody's talking underneath an air shaft ventilator that pumps air into the room, then that air can spread several feet, much more than 6 feet. So in that case, social distancing in situations like that beyond 6 feet, like you mentioned, 20, 27 feet, is worth considering. So as I sit here today, there's an air vent above me that's blowing air into my room. And as I talk, somebody sitting across the table from me would be more apt to be exposed to aerosols that I'm exuding as I talk. So if I were infected, that would be very dangerous. And that air vent above me would blow the air past me many feet, greater than 6 feet. So that's why it's advisable to maintain a distance, depending on your the configuration of your room, 6 feet or greater. Yeah, can you hear me better now? Yeah, so there was some interference. But what we're learning is that with SARS coronavirus 2, the aged population, say people over 65 years old, are very susceptible to the infection and a bad outcome with the COVID-19 disease. And typically in aged individuals versus young individuals, there are distinct differences in the capacity of the immune response to respond to and control infectious disease pathogens. And we understand this process to be part of an aging program in the immune system that's called immune senescence. It's probably more complicated than that, but what we know is that in aged individuals, the immune response is tuned down, or it switches over more to a response of immune regulation instead of a response that's capable of fast response to an infectious disease. So those people end up being much more susceptible to a bad outcome than do young people who have a very robust immune response that's capable of fast action against this virus. Yeah, so the aerosol transmission of the virus is a major concern. It can survive inside of what are called fomites, saliva droplets that are elicited from people when they talk. The virus is viable, probably we think for several hours in fomites. Fomites get deposited on the surfaces of tables, on your hands, on the surfaces of doorknobs, and anything that you touch. And the virus can survive in that environment for 30 minutes to 3 hours, maybe even longer. And so that's why it's very important to decontaminate surfaces and control the aerosol spread of the virus. You see many people walking around masks on their face to contain the spread. I think that's important for people who are actually known to be infected, if they're around other people, to wear a mask. If you're not infected, the important thing is to make sure the surfaces you touch are clean, or you are maintaining social distancing to reduce exposure to aerosols coming from